Hey friends, I wanted to make a video about a book that I'm reading called The Soul of America. It's by Jon Meacham. It won the Pulitzer Prize and it has a lot of really cool stories from history in it. And I thought it would be cool to kind of highlight one of the chapters that I thought was really um, awesome. It's actually called What the Hell is the Presidency For? And it is a story about the struggle against segregation in the South. It involves Lyndon Johnson, Martin Luther King's Crusade, and LBJ in the Crucible. And I actually wanted to make this video because I found this statistic again earlier that said 36% of young people across 21 different countries say they often feel anxious, worried, or nervous about the future. And I get that that totally makes sense. I am also sometimes worried or nervous, but what I found in this book was it explores moments of incredible difficulty in American history, and it shows actually how the good forces prevailed over it. So, wanted to make this video because the goal is to, with our history class, is to the best of our ability understand our place and our purpose in history, and also to provide someone how to think about historical contexts. Teachers, our job isn't to tell students what to think, but rather teach them how to think about something. So I pulled some excerpts from the book, I pieced them together, and yeah, actually James Baldwin says it much better at the beginning. History, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely, or even principally, to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. So the more that we can understand history, I think the more we can, maybe our fears can be assuaged about what might happen moving forward, because our goal is to find our place in history. So the crux of the video is going to deal first some heavier history about segregation in the South. And I bring it back to the Civil War. These are two other quotes. This is from Jefferson Davis. After the defeat of the former Confederate States, he was the president of the Confederacy. He said, "The principle for which we contended is bound to reassert itself, though it may not be at another time and in another form." Part of this principle that he's talking about referred to slavery. And I'll try to, through history, show that he is stating that slavery or like racism is going to come up again. This is, I think, a potent reminder to me that we need to be wary that racist attitudes and minds can still exist, and that it's important to understand where those attitudes can come from. It says, "We may say only at the moment when Lee handed Grant his sword was the Confederacy born, or to state matters another way, in the moment of death, the Confederacy entered upon its immortality." And I will again try to go through some different sources and say what he's saying with us, because the legacy of the Civil War was that racist attitudes did persist, and it's not actually surprising when we think about that. So the story starts off with some heavy history. He talks about this year of 1963. Governor George Wallace of Alabama had tried to actually stop integration at the university. It was ordered to have black students come, but they weren't allowed to. Medgar Evers was a director of the NAACP. He was assassinated. This is also the year that Martin Luther King gives his "I Have a Dream" speech. But we still have horrible history later on. In September, we have the brutal deaths of the 4 girls on the 16th Street Baptist bombing in Birmingham, Alabama. It breaks your heart. The 4 were Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Carol Denise McNair. This is just pure hatred, and racism rearing its face. This is in 1963. And also, too, I forget, well, if I go back, the ending of this video deals with 2 important pieces of legislation: the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So in order to get to those triumphs, we have to actually go back and place the context. So a little bit of history and a little bit of years. I always say that some history kids think, oh, I have to memorize years. You don't have to memorize years, but it does help to have some context between what was the Emancipation Proclamation. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln issued the order stating that all slaves that were in Union territory would be free. Later in 1865, the 13th Amendment is passed, banning slavery. And 1963 is when this is happening. This is just 100 years. It's not a long time. So, again, the speech that MLK gave, he says 50 years ago, he's talking about Abraham Lincoln. And 100 years later, he says the battle is still going on. So I did also put some years down because the slavery in what would later become the United States began in 1619. I'm not going to go into all the aspects of slavery in the U.S., but it was officially abolished in 1865. So that's 246 years. And this is not a good map. I should have used it. But if you look in the mostly red states, this is where slavery was allowed to exist for much of what would first be British colonial history, Native American history, and then American history. But for a number of reasons, slavery just existed here. Perhaps one of the most telling reasons was just the presence of crops that could be harvested at quick rates with just the American South. It's a climate where eventually slavery could exist, but it could exist there for 246 years. But if we go to today, because I'm an ardent believer that we still need to be fighting against racism and any of its ways of impacting our students, that's only 160 years where slavery has actually been illegal. So slavery has been legal much longer than it has been illegal. And I think we still deal with those mindsets still today. To go back into what happened to bring the Civil War about, there's a lot of history that goes into it. But the slave states and the free states acted in interest with one another. They were more or less on the same team to try to pass certain legislation. So slavery was expanding. We have more court cases. And the war was linked to slavery as a component. And sometimes I talk and I think about like soldiers that were fighting for the Union, soldiers that were fighting for the Confederacy. There is still in American history like this yearning or this longing for, these were brave soldiers too. And the North had troops that were racist and they weren't fighting to end slavery. And to that I come back and say, I think ignorance is the real enemy. There were soldiers that fought for the Confederacy that didn't have anything to do with slavery. They wanted to defend their homes. So I say, who's the good and who's the bad in the Civil War? It's complicated. It's not as if to say one side is all good, one side is all bad. But the ignorance and the idea that we could still allow slavery to exist at that time, that's the real enemy. If we want to find another quote that explains the connection to slavery, this is Alexander Stephens. He was the vice president of the Confederacy. I put this quote just up here about slavery, and you can read that. But that is the connection between the Confederacy and slavery. The post-Civil War years then, so if we go back from 1865 onward, and we're still back in, we're leading up to 1963, there is 246 years, again, being a long time. After the Civil War ended, slavery was abolished, but the minds and the attitudes that had existed for so long are still going to exist. Maya Angelou has a harrowing story from her memoir, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. She was growing up in the South. I forget what state she was from right now, but she explains what the post-Civil War years were like. She She and her brother were 3 and 4, had been put on a train to travel alone from Long Beach, California to Stamps, Arkansas, where their grandmother ran a country store. One evening, Angela recalled hearing the hoofbeats of the sheriff's horse in the yard. His twang, she wrote, joggled in the brittle air. He warned of a planned clan night raid. Angela's Uncle Willie, the sheriff, said, "Better lay low tonight. A black man had apparently messed with a white lady today. Some of the boys will be coming over here later." And Angela writes about just the terror and the fear of that. But she says later on she's almost just as mad about the sheriff. It's condescension. And just telling this person, this individual, that you're just supposed to lay low. Like, I think this story captures a lot of what what living with racism really was. At the same time, we still have George Wallace, the governor of Alabama. He writes in a famous speech 100 years later, after this is in the middle of the Civil War. He says, he's giving a speech, and he called the South this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of great Anglo-Saxon Southland. Wallace cried. This is 100 years later. "In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny. I say, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." So here's where Lyndon Johnson comes into play. Johnson wasn't like an ardent civil rights leader early on in his youth, but as he grew and as he began to experience more of what was happening in this country, his interactions with MLK, his mind starts to change. So I don't know how all the politics of it work, but Johnson wanted to pass a civil rights act that would make it illegal to allow someone to the access to something because of the color of their skin, and would provide, or at least provide the platform for making segregation illegal. Brown versus Board of Education had happened in 1954 that desegregated the schools, but he was able to coalesce around other senators and congressmen, and he said, another guy, "We'll have a mutiny in this country. We've got to make an American bill and not just a Democratic bill." He used similar language in talking to Dirksen. "We don't want this to be a Democratic bill," Johnson told the Republican from Illinois. "We want it to be an American bill. It's going to be worthy of the land of Lincoln. And the man from Illinois is going to pass this bill, and I'm going to see that he gets proper credit." He was able to get Democrats and Republicans to understand the bill. Many of the Southern Democrats, especially, and Southern Republicans, stated that, like, hey, if they pass a bill for equal rights, that's gonna ruin my chance to be reelected. And Johnson was able to appeal to a sense of altruism, and really was able to describe that this transcended politics. So in the book, Jon Meacham talks about several interactions he has with individuals, including George Wallace of Alabama. MLK is also helping to promote this and change Johnson's mind. He says, and you know, my friends, King said, "There comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. There comes a time, my friends, when people get tired of being plunged across the abyss of humiliation where they experience the bleakness of nagging despair. There comes a time when people get tired of being pushed out of the glittering sunlight of life's July and left standing amid the piercing chill of an alpine November." But he's able to craft these words together. And the Civil Rights Act was signed on July 2nd, 1964. But Meacham tells us that despite legislative triumphs, there's still going to be more trouble ahead. It's not going to be smooth. It's not going to be consistent. He says history has, what does he say? He calls it wrongful chords of history mixing together. So this wasn't just the end. The road to the Voting Rights Act 1 year later, we had Bloody Sunday, which was a march that King and his colleagues took. I also Again, to go back to numbers, in 1963, he's delivering the I Have a Dream speech, and just 2 years later, we have an event like Selma, Alabama, which was in the seat of Dallas County. On March 7th, a voting rights march from Selma to Montgomery had begun when Alabama state troopers charged a line of nonviolent demonstrators, trapped between asphalt and his uniformed attackers at the front door of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Inhaling tear gas and reeling from 2-year-old Billy club blows to his head, John Lewis, then 25 years old, felt everything dimming. This was a attempt to bring awareness to voter suppression in the South. Part of the Reconstruction Amendments ensured voting rights regardless of race, but there were lots of ways to get around that, especially in the South. Sometimes a black voter would be asked to do something like recite the entire Constitution before they can vote, or they would need to explain what issues they're voting for and why, and they could be pushed and they could be hurt. And this march, which was supposed to draw attention to the inability of many to vote, drew attention and made a great movie. I always tell kids, if you can, like, Selma's awesome. And it says one dream can change the world. So Johnson gives a speech to Congress on March 15th of 1965. This is still before, or right about the time when the Vietnam War was beginning to escalate, but Johnson has a great speech, and I really like this. He says, "At times, history and fate meet at a single time in a single place, to shape a turning point in a man's understanding of his unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington Concord. So it was a century ago at Appomattox. And so it was in Selma, Alabama." This was the birth of the American Revolution that brought together words like entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Appomattox was the Civil War, which was an attempt to give that country, to quote Lincoln, a new birth of freedom. And Selma, Alabama is 100 years after Appomattox, and the fight is still happening. In our time, we have come to live with moments of great crisis. Our lives have been marked with debate about how great issues of war and peace, property and depression, but rarely in time does an issue lay bare the secret heart of America itself. Rarely are we met with a challenge not to our growth or abundance, or welfare or security, but rather to the values and the purposes and the meaning of our beloved nation. The issue of equal rights for Americans is such an issue. Who should defeat every enemy, should double our wealth and conquer the stars, and still be unequal to this issue, then we will have failed as a people and as a nation. For with a country as with a person, what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Johnson was able to just put this in such poetic words that influenced and changed the minds of lots of people. Just watching Selma, hearing later from John Lewis, eventually resulted in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which provided more protections to allow everyone, regardless of race, to vote. And 1965 to 2025 isn't that, it's really not long at all. So if we think this fight is over, I think we're gravely mistaken, and we need to be aware and understand our history so that we can, to go back to the beginning quote, understand our purpose and what we're here to do. So great book. I'll maybe do another chapter, but yeah, totally recommend. If we go back to it, it's called The Search for America's Soul by Jon Meacham. Wait. Yeah. Oh, wait a minute. No, The Soul of America. Oh my gosh. The Battle for Our Better Angels. Can't even get the title of it right. It's a great book, though.